All right. Once again, thanks everyone for joining. The committee, I understand, wanted to get together at least once before the holiday break to go over a couple of things that were of interest in discussion last week or a few weeks ago, a couple weeks ago now. So we have an abbreviated agenda tonight, some updates on some follow-up items, as well as a kickoff to some budget discussions for fiscal year 22. We are time boxed. We do have a special full school committee meeting at 7 o'clock. So try to move through our abbreviated agenda with that in mind. With that, I think the first item on the agenda are updates for budget items for fiscal year 21, and the first item was an update on school lunch. And let me turn that over to Dan.
All right, thanks, Mike, and good evening, everyone, and happy Monday and early Merry Christmas to all. Alrighty, so in your packet under attachment A, I'm going to scroll down there now. This was a request actually from member Mitchell relative to the staffing for school lunch. And Margaret has, when she's at full staff, she has 45 FTEs. Currently, she has 36. She is short 9 staff, and this is the end result, again, of remaining remote and then making the adjustments with staffing as a result of that. She is in the process of looking to backfill these 9 positions, but it's been a bit of a challenge. The vacancies were posted both internally as well as on Indeed and in School Spring. So she, as of today, again, her vacancies remain at 9 positions, and as you can see, listing here, the biggest challenge, if you will, is the high school, where she's got 6 staff shortages there. And again, there's a note that she had to move someone from the high school over to Mount View, and then also over at Paxton Center School to address the needs over there. Before I'm just being mindful of the time as well. Before I move on from this, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I'll get into the 2 models that we spoke about at the last meeting also.
Billy.
Yep. So I just had a very quick question when I read this. The 2 staff members that are on loan to other schools, are those counted in the 13 currently at the high school, or are they in addition to?
They are, yeah, I'm sorry.
We don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
It's okay. That's my one question.
She's got 7 people who are there, and she shot 6, and of those 6, 2 of the 6 are the ones who are on loan elsewhere. I apologize.
So
okay, thank you.
I guess we're not doing anywhere near the amount of lunches that we need to. So what determines if we're short? What's the metric that we use to say I do not have enough employees?
So she, in gearing up for the implementation of the hybrid model on January 19th, that in and of itself is going to be a challenge for her to meet the distribution of meals for effective then if indeed we do return on the 19th. And that's driven also too by the student numbers. Again, one of the challenges that she has now is with remote, aside from the special needs students that are in, there is labor involved with preparing meals, preparing the grab and goes, the packaging, and so on and so forth.
Again, I'm not sure, because your next slide, you go into the different things, but I would expect, we're looking at 1,000 meals, 2,000 meals. I mean, those are huge number differences. And we had talked about, hey, should we actually have a policy where we say everybody who's coming to the high school gets a lunch because we get subsidized for it?
And Ben, I did speak to Margaret about that. She doesn't think that it's feasible that we could ask every student to come to the high school and receive that meal. On the one hand, it does make sense, but on the other hand, it's not practical or real that they would even accept the lunch.
I'm not sure I understand your statement, right? This is assuming that there's a hybrid and there are students in the school, right? So I'm not sure I understand when you say, and then if that's not the case, then why do we need 13 people? If that's what they were doing with a full, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it, the total staff members is the way to look at that. That is staffing prior to COVID.
Yes, it is.
So if I just, we're doing 2 cohorts. So let's assume that it's broken into 50% at any one day. So that's half the number of students on any one day. And then if we assume that we are saying that we can't ask the same number of students to come get lunches that they were when the school was fully populated with 3 or 4 lunch periods, I just don't understand the staffing plan, why it needs to be the same pre-COVID.
Dan, okay. I could comment a little bit here. I've talked to Margaret quite extensively on this.
Sure, please. Thank you.
I think the answer to the question really is, unfortunately, it's not like maybe scaling something up where you just go a little bit more. You reach a point where you need another person, and then that's what we're really talking about here. So for right now, we only have some of our cafeterias open. That's why we had the scaled down amount of people. In order to open all our cafeterias, whether we're serving half the population or the whole population, we need this level of staffing in place to prepare those lunches. So that's kind of where we're at here. It's not really a gradual incremental thing. You need 3 people in this school. You need 2 people in that school. You need 4 people in this school. And that's just where we're at.
So, Bob, if we were to have, for some reason, double the amount of people in the high school tomorrow, would we have been able to feed the same number of, would we be able to feed that volume of people with the same level of staff?
Mike, I'm not sure I understand your question. So if we were hybrid, we have to up the number of staff that are there. Right now, it's there's a few kids that receive lunches, but most of it is for the people that swing by later in the day and get those lunches on twice a week,
No, I guess my question is this. So let me try to clarify it. So if I'm understanding you correctly, the explanation for why we would need to be at the full staffing for hybrid, or the same level of staffing for hybrid as we are pre-COVID, is because there's just certain labor values that need to be accommodated, and it's not a linear function.
Mike, that's a great way to put it, and that is true. Yep.
So if that is true, I guess my question is, if for some reason the school population were to double in size, would we be able to feed that number of students with the same staffing? If we cut it in half, we're feeding with the same number of staff. If we were to double, would we be feeding with the same number of staff? I guess I'm trying to understand that relationship a little bit better, because it seems I come from a background of managing food service, and while I certainly appreciate that it is not linear, I do have trouble believing that the right size for half the population is the same labor size as the full population.
Mike, I can't answer that question in detail. Like, could we cut back at the high school, for instance, 1 person, 2 persons? I can't answer that. I can tell you this, though. In my conversations with Margaret Barton, I did push back on her, like, because I know we're not getting the same revenue back. So for me, it was, okay, so how many people do we absolutely need in this school? How many do we absolutely need there? And that's where these numbers came from. I'm not the food service person, so I can't speak to, could we scale it back, this or that. In my conversation with her, she made a pretty sound case for why she needed these people, this number of staff.
Okay. Ken?
Hi, I just wanted to make sure that I was hearing the answer to the question I had last meeting, and maybe I did. So the question I had last meeting was, we've got 600 kids in the high school building, right, on a hybrid day. It strikes me, not having a food service background, that if we pre-prepared 600 things of food and handed them all out the door, that's a streamlining of process. If they all got one, I don't care what they do with it. They could eat it, I hope. They could give it to their sibling. They could throw it in the trash. I hope they don't do that. But we would get reimbursed for all of those. So my question was, is it fiscally better to just provide a lunch for every kid who comes in the door and charge the federal government $365, whatever it is for it? Or is it fiscally better to just serve the ones who come? Because I wasn't sure where the marginal cost was between labor, which seems fixed to me, and materials, which seems variable based on based on the serving size. And Mike, you might be able to frame that better from a business background if I'm not being clear from my
I think
business background.
I'm sorry, Mike.
I said I think that was a good way to ask the question.
Okay. So to respond to the question, I would argue that it's not responsible, and I think Margaret probably said the same, but I don't want to speak for Margaret, to hand every student a lunch, knowing that there is a cost associated with that, because I mean, there is the likelihood that no sooner did I walk out the door when maybe it ends up in the trash, or maybe it ends up on the ground at the high school. I think Margaret would argue that the lunch should be distributed to those students who are wanting the meal, and thus we would receive the appropriate reimbursement for that.
Ken, if I could also add to that a little bit, I think in Margaret's conversations with me, it's not preparing the number of lunches for the kids that are in school on that day. It's preparing the number of lunches for kids who will take it. So it's a little bit different. So we can have lunches there and offer it to students, and then we can claim the reimbursement. We can't claim reimbursement for any that the kids don't take. So it's a fine line there, but it is a lower number than the total number of kids that are in school.
So Dan,
I just think when you create a barrier, if you took the barrier down, I feel kids would take it. But I guess Margaret and the administration disagree, so I won't belabor it. I just feel like my question is really just more a financial one. Would we be better off if we did that? Not like a philosophical or way wasting food question, but I don't need to belabor this.
Oh, Ken, I agree with you. Actually, I was thinking that because I know when I was a kid, half the kids, your parents tell you to eat lunch, and you don't always eat it if you don't like what they have, but you still buy lunch. I don't know. It's a thought. I mean, because I think the parents probably would be very supportive of that. And I don't think it's that much different than what happens on a typical day if your parents send you to school to buy lunch, and if you just happen to not like it, kids get creative, but we still provide it. So I don't know. I guess
I thought it's what WPS did. Like, I could be wrong, but I thought that was the way Worcester Public Schools work.
I think they provide lunch for all their kids anyways, because they're universal lunch program all the time. But I think I'm also, we don't know the numbers until we actually have students in the building. But I also wonder, we probably have a lot of kids who might have a higher need than they might want to portray. They maybe aren't used to getting school lunch, but might need to because of the finances, and there may be stigma around that. And so from that perspective, I think it also makes sense to think more broadly rather than not. I mean, that's, I think, why the federal government said that everyone could be provided a lunch in these times.
I think we're basically almost talking the same thing here. The goal is to provide lunches for every kid that wants to take it. We can't force a student to take a lunch. Any student that takes a lunch, we can claim the reimbursement. So I think we're just about on the same page here with what we're doing. Our goal is not to set up artificial barriers or to prepare 100 less lunches just because that's what we want to do. Our goal is to prepare as many lunches as kids will take.
Yeah. Ken, again, I wasn't at the last meeting, but help me. What is the why behind the question? Because I feel like perhaps it's not clear to me, and maybe that's what's getting lost in this.
So I guess the why, my question was, we're losing money on food, right, this year, because we have a fixed cost, in my mind, for staff. We have a variable cost on supplies, and we have a set reimbursement rate, which we normally don't get. So we have like a built-in, locked-in customer, and we're actually getting more money from the federal government than we typically charge for students. So my why was, is there a way we can lose less money if we sell more food, or would we lose more money if we sold more food? Like, was my economics question, and again, beyond the more moral question of it, was, if we went from selling 400 to 600 lunches a day at the high school, are we going to lose more money, or are we going to lose less money because we sold 200 more lunches? That was my question, as a way to try and close that gap between our negative 400 some thousand and less, or more, if it cost us more than $365 a lunch for the 500 and 600th lunch. It probably cost us more for the first lunch because of all the people, but the 500 and 600th lunch, we might be making money. And that was a question I wasn't sure the answer to.
Right. Dan, I think you have it on the next slide that might give Mike a little more clarification. It was because we're operating in a loss right now, Mike.
Yeah, no, that's what I heard Ken just say, right?
Right.
That's the point that I wanted to bring forward. And yeah, I do think it's appropriate for us to. So Dan, why don't you go ahead and walk us through this, and let's keep an eye towards the question of, why is it that we're in a situation where we're losing money on food, and what if anything can we do differently to narrow that gap? Is what I'm hearing is being the spirit of the questions today.
So first of all, we're losing money on food simply because of the pandemic and the fact that the school lunch program as we see it today is not the same school lunch program from I'll say a year ago, last December, prior to the pandemic. She does not have in her reimbursements now any a la carte sales. That's number one. Number two, catering that Margaret would do is, for all intents and purposes, non-existent. Those are two streams right there. And number three, just in terms of the numbers of students, again, the district has lost approximately 465 students there, plus or minus. Between last year and this year, at least as of now, and all those factors contribute to the loss.
So it looks like you're attempting to quantify that for us in this document. So can you walk us through that?
Sure thing. So, and we had spoken about this, Mike, at our last meeting. So the first, what I'll call Model A, the hybrid model, and that's on the premise that we're hybrid from January 19th to June of 2021. And from the period of July through October of 20, Margaret picked up approximately 157,000 in change. From November through June, actually that should be June of 2021, she's estimating that her revenues would be approximately $345,325 for a total of just under $503,000. The next line is looking at the reimbursement for the hybrid meals only, and that's based on the assumption that there are 2,300 students in the buildings, and she's using the daily rate of 363 in 95 days there. She's estimating that the reimbursement would be approximately just under $800,000. Just want to jump down to the fourth line here for a second, and this is something new that wasn't in the previous presentation. And we were informed about 2 weeks ago that the DESE was making available to districts an additional sum of money. And as the note states, this is these additional dollars through COVID funds that they've made available to districts. In Wachusett's allocation is approximately just under $11,000 at $10,894. And again, this is an additional reimbursement for meals that were served last spring from April through this past November. All said and done, in terms of her revenues, looking at what was taken in from July through October, projected from November to June, she's looking at approximately $1.3 million. In terms of the food cost, and what Margaret does is that she assumes an average here for her food cost. And typically that average is anywhere between 34 and 38%. And she was hoping that for the purpose of this exercise that it would be less, but again, she used 38% of her revenue for food cost. And so for this period of time, she's looking at just under $500,000 at $495,000 and change. In terms of the wages, and this is the big number here. Again, the 24,369, those that is Margaret's wages for the period of July through October. What we've done is that we have backed out of her budget, her salary for the balance of the year, and her salary is being paid through the general fund. For the period of July through October, her wages were approximately just under $124,000, $123,774. She's estimating, again, for November through June, that her wages would be approximately $625,000 and change, and for a total of almost $750,000. And that is based on the premise that there are 95 days between January 19th and June of 2021 where we are hybrid, and also that she has backfilled 5 of her 9 vacancies. There are some other costs as well, which are somewhat challenging, and her paper cost, which are fairly significant, as well as other costs. And these other costs include milk cooler rentals, equipment repair, equipment purchases, and travel for staff, gas for the stoves, and also chemical treatments in terms of the sanitation in the kitchens and in the cooking area. Total cost, again, looking at this using the hybrid model, Margaret was projecting a shortfall here of approximately $65,000 in change, again, using the hybrid scenario from January 19th to June of 2021. If we were to remain remote in the second model here, let's increase the size just a tad. If we were to remain remote, in terms of the curve in the meal reimbursement for July through October, again, approximately 157,000. From November to June of 2021, 5.25. For a total of just under $683,000. In here, she's estimating 1,000 meals on a given day, and the reimbursement is $5.53. And the reason for the difference is that the $5.53 includes not only the lunch, but that also includes a breakfast program as well. There is no change in terms of the July to October revenue. Again, there were reimbursements that had to be paid out, and given the small value that she's estimating for payments under My School Bucks. Total revenue for the remote through June of 2021 would be just under $700,000 at $698,279. Food cost, again, she's using 38% as a figure, a portion of the revenue. Obviously, that figure is adjusted slightly given the fact that her revenues are going to be adjusted accordingly. Similar to above, we shifted this reflects the shifting of her salary from the school lunch to the general fund. And in terms of her labor cost, she's estimating at approximately $717,000, and that's assuming 170 days of remote with the current staffing levels, which means that that would reflect her vacancies, her 9 vacancies. Again, paper cost and other costs are a fairly big ticket item. The difference between the hybrid and the remote, approximately $50,000 in change. Her total cost, her estimated total cost here would be approximately almost $1.2 million, $1,162,798. And in this model here, she's projecting a shortfall of just under $465,000. And as we had spoken at our previous meeting, the game plan then and now, and I've got a meeting tomorrow with Bob and Darryl to discuss this further, would be to look to make an adjustment between school lunch and the general fund, and to either make journal entries between the two so that school lunch remains to the good, because as you know, that cannot end the year in the negative, or we would look to make adjustments perhaps between the product cost as well. But where there is a balance in the general fund, we'd be looking to make adjustments on the salary side to address the shortfall in this second scenario here.
Thank you. That helps me. I probably have a couple questions from that, but let me see if others have questions now that you've gone over that.
I think, Mike, we went over this last week. This is kind of what drove the discussion.
Subcommittee, Carl.
So, and again, I think a lot of this stems from this long-running conversation we've been having about the finances of our school lunch program and how we can really get the most out of it. And it still doesn't quite seem to get at like what our cutoff point is. Like, how many lunches do we need to put out the door just to break even? And we're like, you do some back of the number calculations, and it looks like it's maybe about $1.75 that we net for every meal, based like if staffing stays the same and that kind of thing. But it does seem to convey that the more lunches we put out the door, financially, it seems to be a better thing for us. And as Ken said, maybe there's not the appetite for making it universal lunch, but I don't know. Maybe there's a way we could change our model for this year to an opt out, and so everyone gets a lunch unless parents choose to opt out of that. Maybe that would be a way to get some higher numbers without, again, maybe a way to take down some of those barriers out there while kind of pushing up some of our lunches higher, because it does seem that more lunches is better for our bottom line.
Yeah, so I'll say maybe my quick observations are, to answer your question, Ken, which you started. It seems to me that if you were to double the number of meal reimbursements that we were to receive, probably 85% of those dollars fall to the bottom line, right? Because labor is not quite fixed, but it's nearly fixed, and there's not a lot of variable cost here. Maybe 85 is a little too high. Maybe it's about 80%, but it does make me wonder too, in the remote model, whether we are appropriately right-sizing the staff, if that in fact is the case. Because if you look at this, it's almost like if I do 2,000 or 3,000 remote student meals, probably 80% of those dollars flow to the bottom line. Am I understanding that correctly? And is that a fair statement to say?
So, Mike, I'd be happy to have another discussion with Margaret about this, and particularly to drill down on the staffing here. The takeaway that I have from this discussion here is that if her FTEs, if she's looking at 45 staff pre-COVID, then is that the appropriate number in COVID, especially if we are remote, or even if we go with the hybrid. When we go with the hybrid model in January, because obviously that impacts the bottom line. And again, we'd be happy to again revisit the discussion on the number of meals that could be distributed, which would lead to obviously additional reimbursement dollars. But let's not lose sight of the fact that even if we do bump up some of these numbers here in terms of the meals that are going to be reimbursed, and if we do drill down and make adjustments in the staffing pattern here, that we can't lose sight of the fact that, as I stated earlier in this discussion, that she's lost, for the most part, again, a la carte sales, number one, and number two, catering. And I don't have the figures here, but they did and do contribute to her bottom line, and we can't lose sight of the fact that those numbers are going to be very much skewed in FY21.
Yeah, I think there's no question that there's a revenue side problem here. I guess the point that I would highlight and bring attention to, as I think others probably have as well, particularly as you project the year in a remote model, whether or not we are right-sizing the workforce, which is the majority of the cost that's associated with that, to meet the demand or meet the revenue expectations that we're going to have. So there's two ways of adjusting it. I mean, one was a kind of a creative idea that I heard earlier as well. I mean, what if where people were taking the meal and our reimbursements are higher? And he said, well, we're going to give it to everybody who wants it. And I get that. But then the other side of the equation is if we have less revenue, then we need to right size the right size. So it sounds like there's some follow up there. Any other questions on this topic before we move on? All right. The next item we had here was regional transportation update.
So just very quickly, Mike, we are still in negotiations with AA Transportation. We're going to speak about this tonight later in executive session. And I also did have a conversation with Jay Sullivan, Associate Commissioner of School Finance for DESE. And what he shared with me is that, and this was approximately a week or so ago, that at that time he was still chasing districts down for their FY20 end of the year report. So he still wasn't sure of what his exposure would be for reimbursements across the Commonwealth. We left that conversation with let's continue to dialogue with each other. Number one, that I would continue to apprise him as to where we stand with our negotiations. Certainly when a decision is made, hopefully sooner than later, be happy to do that. And then conversely, when I do circle back with him, hopefully he'll be in a better position, having received those outstanding EORs, that he'll know what his exposure is in terms of reimbursement for FY21. And because of these challenges, he did say to me that don't expect across the board reimbursements. Typically, they would have been made in January, of the new calendar year, and he said that that's very unlikely. Most likely, it'll be sometime in February at the earliest.
So, irrespective of the negotiation details, are there any questions from anyone on regional transportation?
Maybe just a comment that I guess that's good. That's better than we heard last time, that Jay's at least willing to entertain the fact that you may be able to amend the EOR, right, given that not all districts have turned it in, if we can quickly come to an agreement.
Yes. Again, I'm just being sensitive and respectful of negotiations, and again, we're going to speak to this tonight in executive session. But I would say, Ken, that yes, my takeaway from that conversation with Jay Sullivan was a positive takeaway. I mean, it's not over till it's over, as they say. But that was my takeaway.
Any other questions? So I guess mine, just to be clear, what I think I heard you say, Dan, was that you had a conversation with Jay Sullivan about the possibility of amending our end of year to include, a settlement payment or a readiness payment. What I think I'm understanding you say is that he will not be able to tell, he's not in a position to tell us whether or not those can be considered reimbursable dollars until he receives all of the district's end of year and sees what they've submitted. I guess I'm having trouble. When I asked the question the last time, my question was, what's the criteria, on what condition do we know whether or not those dollars could be reimbursed or not?
I guess, Mike, to draw an analogy, the analogy that I'm going to draw is circuit breaker, and oftentimes school business officials will ask Jay, what's the reimbursement going to be? What's the percent going to be? What's the dollar amount going to be? And he'll often respond, I can't answer that question until we have with the circuit breaker program that all claims are filed, in this case in early July, and that they do their analysis on those claims there. The takeaway that I have from the conversation, Mike, is that I mean, certainly Jay knows the pool of money that he has available to him. But what he doesn't know, I don't think, and I don't want to speak for Jay Sullivan either, but what he doesn't know is, what's the reimbursement rate going to be? Is it going to be 84%? Is it going to be 70%? What's it going to be? And what does that translate across the board? So I think that's the unknown. That's a takeaway that I had with that conversation.
So I guess I had a clarifying question, because I feel like I heard Mike and Dan saying addressing different questions. So it must be my listening skills. So I think the question what I heard Dan say was that what was uncertain was the reimbursement rate, not whether readiness payments were reimbursable. I heard Mike ask, do we know if readiness payments are reimbursable, not necessarily the rates, which we won't know. So I feel like there was some incongruity in what I was hearing between the question and the answer. So I'll, putting that all aside, my question is, regardless of whatever the rate's going to be, who knows what that'll be, are readiness payments going to be considered reimbursable?
Across the board, the answer is yes. Just in general terms.
But the reason that we're asking these, the reason I think we're probing here, Dan, is because we've gone back and forth on this a little bit, right? I mean, we at one point we were saying yes, and then at some point we said no, and now it sounds like we're saying maybe. So in the case of Wachusett, right, are readiness payments going to be considered reimbursable?
Mike, I'm not in a position to speak for Jay Sullivan, but I'm going to try and put it to you this way, as best I can. My takeaway from the conversation that I had with him is that he will certainly work with me once this issue gets resolved. He will work with me. Doesn't mean that we're gonna see an additional $200,000-$300,000. But I'm going to take him at his word that he's going to work with me, and that the bigger challenge is that once we do resolve this matter with AA Transportation, which we are going to speak about tonight in executive session. So I'm just trying to be sensitive to that and respectful of that. I think there might be an early Christmas present.
Any other questions? All right. Let's move on to athletic revolving.
All right, and again, Mike, I'm just being sensitive of the time. It's we're almost pushing 6:45, and just the FY22 budget priorities as well. So this was a question that was raised towards the end of our last meeting, looking at athletics, looking at revenues vis-a-vis expenditures. And in my packet, there was an executive summary that spoke to this, and I'm just going to highlight that very quickly. The high school did not make adjustments in the rates this year, even though we're in the midst of a pandemic. And as I wrote, and as Jen Lynch argues, is that Wachusett's rates have not been adjusted in the better part of 10 years. I think 8 years. I apologize, 8 years. I think I drew the analogy that though Shrewsbury made adjustments in their rates for this year, and again, this was in my executive summary. Their pre-COVID fee was $325 per student, and they reduced it by $50. The rates that are currently there now don't meet our needs. With COVID, transportation has changed. As I wrote, we're no longer in a position where we can use our leased vehicles to transport the golf team. Instead, we need to transport students on buses, and to get a team to a game or a match, that's going to require maybe 3 buses as opposed to 2 buses, or 2 buses as opposed to one bus. There are costs that are continuing to every year increase. Transportation increases. That's a contractual obligation. The MIAA each year increases the cost of the officials. We have no control over that. Even in this age of the pandemic, they're still looking to increase fees. Assigner fees increase. The MIAA dues increase. The cost of equipment increases. The cost of reconditioning our equipment it goes up every year, as do supplies as well. So you have here just kind of a summary of where Jen Lynch thinks that we may land this year. And these are very preliminary figures. We started out the year with the high school with a balance, a good balance of approximately almost $108,000, 107,806, and again, that is the end result of activity at the end of FY20, where we were making adjustments between the general fund and the athletic revolving to build up the balance for FY21. Her revenues, and again, this is an estimate, approximately 222,000, and on this sheet here, these are her projections based upon estimated number of participants in the revenues for those athletes. And again, one of the challenges with COVID too is that the rosters, and I'm just going to use basketball as an example, the rosters might have perhaps 14 students or maybe 15 students on a varsity basketball team. Now they're limited to 12 students, so that's going to potentially impact the revenue side. And again, these are revenues. This is a snapshot looking at where she is in this moment in time. In terms of the expenditures, and again, the expenditures, these are our estimates. She's looking at approximately 126,536 as expenditures. Those figures certainly may change. One of the unknowns in that certainly could be the transportation cost, especially as teams get into the seasons. And as she pointed out to me, given COVID, the high school now is not going to be playing teams in Central Mass per se, but they'll be going east and they'll be going west, not only during the playoffs, but during the regular season, and that's there's going to be a cost associated with that. And if there was one bus going to Eastern Mass for a basketball game, as I said a moment ago, there might be 2 buses now that may have to travel east, again, given the restrictions of COVID. Going back to the summary sheet, so at this point in time, again, she's estimating that her ending balance is just under 204,000 at 203,519. And these are very fluid figures, as I often say. And certainly as we get into the winter sports, and then we get into fall too, and refine the number of participants, obviously that'll impact these figures here. So that was a quick summation. I'd be happy to answer questions, and I'm just being sensitive to the agenda and the time that we have allotted us tonight.
Dan, I have a couple questions, but I'm happy to email them. They're not urgent given the timing. They're just clarifying some things.
So if I may, Mike, I'd be happy to take Malaya's questions in writing, then I'd be happy to follow up to the full committee so that we're all on the same page.
That would be great. Ken, you have a question?
Just a quick thing. I'll admit my bias here as a track parent who's, it seems as though you have 3 sports that drive your expenses. and you have a couple sports to drive your revenue in terms of participant numbers, that as you talk about raising fees, you're going to get some pushback from parents in the community about why one sport is highly subsidizing another. So I think that's just something to put on the table when you have these conversations about if there's a more nuanced model going forward about the fees matching the expenses for that team.
Understood.
Any other questions? I mean, I guess the one observation that I'd make, right, is that, the statement that our fees don't cover our expenses. Well, in this year, it certainly looks like our projected revenue is covering our expenses by, almost $100,000. And so, I know that there are people in the community that are asking, given the shortened seasons, given the scaled down version of the sport this year, is it appropriate to have a scaled down version of the fee? I don't know the answer to that question, but at least it certainly appears that we're covering ourselves for this year based on what you're showing us on the screen.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Next item on the agenda, we have about 9 minutes before we break. 8 minutes now is, Dan, you wanted to convene a discussion on fiscal 22 budget priorities.
Sure. Thank you. So, Mike, this is going back to one of our earlier meetings this past fall. You had requested that as I worked on the budget calendar for 22, that we set up in essence, this meeting here to hear from the committee, their thoughts on the 22 budget. So again, and this is to be continued because this discussion certainly doesn't. 8 minutes doesn't merit the value of this discussion. I mean, 8 times 80.
No, I do recall that conversation. And just to be clear, I think what I was trying to express, at least for my part, was that the conversation on budget priorities ought to happen with the full school committee, and that perhaps upon reflection of that conversation, this committee could meet to further discuss and refine. So, while I do think it's important for us to have that conversation, I think to me it's almost more important, right, that the full committee be involved in the conversation on budget priorities, and that in the past, at least the last couple of years, I'm not sure that that's really happened. Any other perspectives? That's my perspective on this, but any other thoughts?
I share that perspective, but I didn't see the harm in if we have thoughts to throw those out as a starting point, because we will certainly look at this in more detail than the rest of the committee, and the 22 people gets a bit cumbersome. So I didn't see any. I wasn't surprised to see it as a subset of a bigger discussion, but I agree with you.
Yeah, I guess my opinion is sometimes, Mike, your narrative helps clarify some points in a different speak. Dan's explains it to the T and goes through it, but there are times for the whole school committee, it sometimes helps more of it's kind of an executive summary that Dan has done before, but just a different person's view who doesn't live in the numbers. Mm-hmm. I think that's the opinion that this group brings, and preface, to say prior to that is to give this group's kind of opinion on it and just some highlights, and then let Dan go through his narrative.
One way that conversation might be able to be helped with numbers is if we can quantify what we've chosen to lose this year to face the realities that were put upon us. Like as a for instance, we cut teachers at Mount View and we cut programs at Mount View, right? In terms of a foreign language and of strings. If we could have some sense of what we cut and what that saved us. So as we have the conversations about priorities, there's 2 columns there. There's like the priority philosophically, there's the cost monetarily, and we have to balance those, right? But I think having that in front of us it would be helpful to me. Because I don't think we ever really had that conversation when those cuts were made from a curriculum perspective. And that's to some degree not just a Dan question, sort of a Daryl question as well. Mm-hmm. The budgetary ramifications of curriculum cuts and the curriculum ramifications of budget cuts, and how those are interconnected. But from our committee's perspective, having that just number rundown could be helpful, and maybe we could help refine that at a meeting.
Dan, in the or others, in the 5 minutes that we have left, was there specific questions that you had of the committee, or pieces of information that we can provide that would be helpful?
So, Mike, I mean, we're into it now, and certainly looking at the bigger picture. I mean, obviously, salaries is a huge driving force in the budget. Number one, if you recall, too, Daryl and Bob, and Bob is here. You can certainly, I don't want to speak for Bob, but there was a presentation to the full committee looking at a 5-year plan for new positions, and I think where are we now with that? And especially in light of COVID, and how that impacts the future or not. Again, as I said to this group, knock on wood, there are now 2 vaccines out there, and hopefully more. But COVID is not going to be going away at the end of 21. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But I think that we're still going to be feeling the financial impact of it, and how does that impact the new positions that were presented well over a year ago. And let's not lose sight of the fact that there is no bottomless well, as we know, as I've shared with this committee. Our Chapter 70, we took a $408,000 hit. In essence, that $408,000 hit was the implementation of the SOA, and that's still an unknown. And as this group knows, I think the whole committee knows, we were going to see the SOA in 2 areas. Number one, we're going to see in our Chapter 70, which didn't happen, and we were also going to see it in Circuit Breaker, which didn't happen either. And as you all know, there was going to be a phase in 21, for transportation, and that didn't happen. So as every year, there are many balls up in the air relative to the budget. Monies drive decisions, but let's face it, there isn't a money tree outside my office here. At least I'm not aware that's going to make all this happen.
Dan, I had a comment on the circuit breaker.
Please.
I know we're missing the SOA. It's not a circuit breaker. I know we're missing the SOA funds. But my understanding, and I hope as the budget process goes on, you might clarify this, was that had to be designated for specific purposes with the plan, which we're talking about, I guess, in January. And in our case, it was mostly students with disabilities. And so it wasn't really intended to be just dumped into the general fund for all students and all purposes. It had some limits to how it could be used.
Yes.
And so I hate to hear that referred to as just a general drop in Chapter 70, because it had a specific use. It wasn't just free money we could use for any purpose. Perhaps I'm wrong, but that was my understanding.
No, that's correct. And I was just that's correct. And when I was referring to the 408,000, I was just looking at the cumulative hit to Chapter 70 without looking, well, what's behind that hit? What is negatively impacted with that hit? And that's the piece that you're speaking to.
Right.
So it looks like we're up on the hour, so I'd be happy to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
And Rebecca, do you mind calling the vote here? Or I can do it. Just go by my screen. Ken?
Yes.
Dan?
Absolutely. Dennis?
Dennis, yes.
Dennis?
Yes.
Dennis?
Can you hear me, Rebecca? Can other people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay. Why don't I go ahead and do it real quick, Rebecca?
Mitchell, yes.
Thank you. Carl?
Yes.
And Malia?
Yes.
Thank you, folks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dan.
We'll see you on the other side.
I can hear you,
Good night.
Mike. Can you
Thanks.
hear me?
Yeah, we're good.
I can hear you now. We just adjourned.